The bullet had already left the chamber before most men would have even seen the target. But Silas Crowe wasn't most men. For 17 years, Silas Crowe had been the name whispered around campfires from the Texas plains to the California territories, always in hushed tones, always with a glance over the shoulder. He was the man they sent when talking failed. The man they hired when mercy had run its course, the relentless shadow that tracked Apache war parties, renegade bands, and anyone foolish enough to carry a price on their head across the southwestern territories. The desert sun had carved deep lines into his face, lines that told stories of countless hunts, endless pursuits, and a life lived entirely in the space between civilization and the wild. His hands, weathered, scarred, steady as ancient stone, had never trembled. Not once, not when he tracked the Mendez brothers through a 3-day blizzard in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, not when he cornered Black Knife's raiders in that canyon near Tucson, and certainly not now as he crouched behind a boulder formation, studying the narrow valley below where smoke rose in thin ribbons from hidden fires. This was supposed to be simple, clean, the way all his hunts ended, swift, efficient, final. The railroad companies had paid him in gold, the territorial governor had given him written authority, the local ranchers had pooled their resources and added to the bounty, all for one purpose: to eliminate the threat of the small Apache band that had been raiding supply lines, stealing cattle, and vanishing like smoke into the Chiricahua wilderness. 43 confirmed raids in 6 months. That's what the report said. 43 times these people had struck and disappeared, leaving nothing but confusion and anger in their wake. The settlers wanted blood, the business interests wanted security, and Silas Crowe, he wanted what he always wanted, the satisfaction of a job completed, the weight of payment in his saddlebag, and the silence that came after. He'd been tracking this particular band for 11 days. 11 days of reading signs that most men wouldn't even recognize. A disturbed stone here, a broken twig there, the faint impression of a moccasin in sand that would be erased by the next wind. The Apache were ghosts when they wanted to be, but even ghosts left traces for those who knew how to look. The valley below was their mistake. Their one crucial mistake. They'd grown comfortable, perhaps even careless. The location was defensible, yes. High walls, limited approaches, good sightlines. But it was also a trap for those inside if someone patient enough, skilled enough, determined enough, decided to wait them out. And patience, that was something Silas Crowe had in abundance. From his vantage point, he could see the layout of their temporary camp, 15, maybe 20 souls total, women grinding mesquite beans, children. He pushed that thought away. This was the job. This was always the job. Men checking weapons, tending to horses, preparing for another raid, or perhaps planning their next move. They had no idea that death itself was perched above them, calculating angles, counting heads, planning the inevitable. His rifle, a custom Sharps .50 caliber that had cost him more than most men earned in a year, rested across his knee. The weapon was an extension of himself, as familiar as his own heartbeat. He knew its quirks, its tendencies, the way the barrel heated in direct sunlight, and how that affected the trajectory. At this distance, 200 yards with elevation advantage, the shot was almost certain. Almost. Because something made him pause. Not hesitation. Silas Crowe didn't hesitate. But something in the air had shifted. A change in the wind, perhaps. Or that sixth sense that had kept him alive when lesser hunters had died. That primal awareness that whispered warnings in a language older than words. He'd learned long ago to trust those whispers, even when they made no logical sense. The sun climbed higher. The heat became oppressive. Sweat traced paths through the dust on his face, but he didn't move, didn't shift position, didn't even blink more than necessary. This was the part of hunting that separated the professionals from the amateurs, the ability to become stone, to surrender to stillness so complete that even the lizards forgot you were there. His mind wandered to the places it always went during these long watches, to the life he'd left behind, if you could call it a life, to the farm in Missouri that had burned, to the family that had been taken by raiders. Different raiders, different tribe, different time, but did that really matter? To the moment when a 12-year-old boy had picked up his father's rifle with hands too small to hold it steady and sworn an oath that had shaped every day since. Revenge, they called it. Justice, others said. Silas didn't call it anything anymore. It was simply what he did, what he was, the hunter, the tracker, the closer of accounts, the man who finished what others couldn't. Below, the camp continued its daily rhythm, cooking, repairing, living. They were good at this, he had to admit. Good at survival in a land that killed the weak and the slow. Good at adaptation in a world that was changing too fast, squeezing them into smaller and smaller spaces. Good at defiance when surrender would have been easier. A part of him, a small, buried part that he tried not to acknowledge, respected that, understood it even. But respect didn't change the reality, didn't alter the contract, didn't erase the gold that would be waiting when he rode back with proof of completion. The rifle felt heavier than usual. Or perhaps he was just tired. 17 years of this life, of the trail, the pursuit, the kill, of being alone except for his horse and his weapons and his reputation. 17 years of being the thing that people feared, the name that made hard men nervous and foolish men quiet. Was this all there was? This endless cycle of hunt and kill, payment and departure, new contract and new chase? The question surfaced sometimes in these quiet moments, unwelcome and persistent. He always pushed it back down, buried it beneath duty and determination and the weight of that childhood oath. But today it lingered. The afternoon shadows began to lengthen. He'd committed to the shot by now in his mind, had calculated the wind, measured the drop, selected his primary target and 2 backups in case the first missed. All that remained was the execution, the finality, the moment when intent became action and possibility became certainty. His finger moved to the trigger, found its familiar place, applied the first ounce of pressure. 2 pounds remained before the hammer would fall. The crosshairs settled on the center of camp, where the men gathered. 1 shot, then reload, then another. Then chaos, confusion, and the grim work of finishing what he'd started. This was the moment. This was always the moment, the last second before everything changed, before peace became violence, before lives ended and accounts were settled. He'd been here hundreds of times. It never got easier. It never got harder. It simply was. And then she stepped into his line of sight. A woman, carrying water. That's all it was at first. Just another figure moving through the camp, just another person going about the business of survival. His crosshairs tracked her automatically, muscle memory, trained response, the instinct of 17 years. She wasn't his target. His targets were the armed men, the warriors, the threats. But she'd walked into his line of fire, and now everything had to wait until she moved. Seconds passed. She should have moved by now. Should have delivered her water and walked away. But she stopped. Right there, right in the center of everything. Set down her burden. And then she looked up. Not toward him. That would have been impossible. He was too far, too well hidden, too perfectly positioned. There was no way she could know he was there. No logical reason for her to turn her face toward the rocky outcrop where he crouched. But she did. And for the first time in 17 years, Silas Crowe forgot to breathe. Even at this distance, even with the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor, even through the scope that reduced the world to a circle of magnified detail, her eyes found him, or seemed to. It was impossible, had to be. Yet the sensation was undeniable, like being seen not just by another person, but by something deeper, something that looked past the hunter, past the rifle. past the 17 years of blood and gold and justified violence, straight into whatever remained of the man he'd been before. His finger loosened on the trigger. Not a conscious choice, not a decision, just a response to something his mind couldn't quite process. The rifle that had always felt like an extension of himself suddenly felt foreign, heavy, wrong. She was young, perhaps 20 summers, perhaps less. The Apache aged differently than white folks, their faces weathered by sun and wind, but their eyes often ancient beyond their years. Her hair caught the late afternoon light, long and dark and unbound. She wore simple buckskin clothing, practical and worn, marked by the kind of repairs that spoke of poverty, scarcity, and making do with what you had. But none of that mattered. None of those details registered in any meaningful way. Because it was her eyes, even at 200 yards, even through heat distortion and optical glass, that held him frozen. They weren't afraid. That was the first thing. Every person he'd ever had in his sights, the moment before they knew they were in danger, had carried fear somewhere in their posture, a tightness, a readiness, an animal awareness of being prey. But this woman, she carried something else entirely, something that looked like sadness, or perhaps recognition, or perhaps acceptance of something inevitable. The moment stretched. His training screamed at him to complete the shot. His contract required it. His reputation depended on it. Every rational thought in his head insisted that he was being a fool, that he was allowing sentiment to compromise a job, that he was letting one woman's accidental glance toward his position create hesitation, where none should exist. But he didn't pull the trigger. She held her position for what felt like an eternity, though, in reality, it was probably no more than 30 seconds. Her face turned toward the outcrop, toward him, and in that span of impossible time, Silas Crowe felt something crack inside his chest. Not break, not shatter, but crack. Like ice at the beginning of spring, like stone under persistent water, like something rigid encountering something it couldn't quite resist. Then she turned away, picked up her water, walked toward the nearest shelter, disappeared from view, and the camp below continued its daily rhythm, completely unaware that death had been sitting above them, finger on the trigger, weighing their fate in grains of gunpowder and ounces of lead. The shot was clear again. The men remained in the open. The angle was perfect. Nothing had changed except everything had changed. The certainty that had carried Silas through 17 years of hunting had developed a crack, small, barely noticeable. But there, he didn't take the shot. Instead, he lowered the rifle, set it beside him with the kind of care a man gives to something precious and dangerous, wiped sweat from his eyes with the back of his hand. And for the first time since he'd taken up this life, he asked himself a question that had no good answer. What am I doing? The sun continued its arc across the sky. The shadows lengthened. The camp below prepared for evening, fires being built, food being prepared, children being called in from play. Normal things, human things, the kind of daily rituals that happened in every settlement, every town, every home across the territories. Silas remained in position, but his mind had left the scope, left the hunt, left the familiar calculations of wind and distance and killing. Instead, it circled back again and again to those eyes, to that moment of impossible connection, to the feeling utterly irrational that she had known he was there. Known and, forgiven him? Challenged him. Asked him a question he didn't yet know how to answer. Night fell across the desert like a curtain. The stars emerged in their thousands, sharp and cold and indifferent to human struggles. Below, the Apache camp settled into evening routines. Fires burned. Shadows moved. Life continued, unaware of how close it had come to ending. Silas made camp in the rocks. No fire, never a fire when on a hunt. Just dried meat and water from his canteen, and the kind of sleepless rest that came from years of sleeping with one eye open. His rifle remained within reach, loaded and ready, but he didn't watch the camp below with the same intensity as before. Instead, he found himself thinking about things he'd buried long ago, about the farm in Missouri and the sound of his mother's voice calling them in for supper, About his sister, younger, laughing, alive, chasing chickens through the yard. About his father teaching him to shoot, not for killing, but for providing, for protection, for the responsible stewardship of power. When had it changed? When had the rifle become an instrument of revenge instead of survival? When had he stopped seeing people below him and started seeing only targets, obstacles, problems to be solved with precision and determination? The night offered no answers. Just the usual desert sounds, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures, the wind moving through stone corridors carved by centuries of patience. He'd spent hundreds of nights like this, thousands perhaps, alone with his weapons and his purpose and the comfortable certainty that he was on the right side of a clear divide. But tonight that divide seemed less clear. The line between hunter and hunted, between justice and revenge, between what was necessary and what was simply convenient, had blurred in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. Dawn came slowly, painting the desert in shades of purple and gold. Below, the camp stirred to life. Women emerged to tend fires. Men checked weapons and horses. Children, and yes, there were children, he couldn't pretend otherwise anymore, played games that probably hadn't changed much in centuries. And there, carrying water again, was the woman. This time Silas watched without the rifle. Watched with just his eyes, just his attention, just the simple act of seeing rather than targeting. She moved with grace through the camp, stopping to speak with an older woman, pausing to adjust a child's clothing, sharing a brief moment of laughter with someone he couldn't see clearly. She was real, not a target, not a problem, not an obstacle between him and payment, just real, a person with relationships and responsibilities and a life that mattered to those around her. The realization should have been obvious, should have been clear from the beginning. But somehow over 17 years of hunting, he'd forgotten how to see people as anything other than contracts. His horse nickered softly from where he'd hidden it in a ravine behind his position, hungry, thirsty, ready to move. The animal didn't care about moral complications or unexpected hesitations. It just knew that they'd been in one place too long, and its instinct said, "Move. Smart horse." Silas gathered his gear with practiced efficiency, rolled his blanket, secured his supplies, checked his rifle, still loaded, still ready, still capable of doing exactly what it had been designed to do. But as he prepared to leave the outcrop, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He would wait, watch, understand what he was really looking at before he did something that couldn't be undone. The hunter had become the student. And the lesson was just beginning. 3 days passed like stones dropping into still water, each one creating ripples that spread wider than the last. Silas moved his position daily, always maintaining distance, always staying hidden, but no longer with the active intent to kill. Instead, he watched, studied, bore witness to something he'd spent 17 years avoiding. The simple, complicated reality of human life. The band numbered 22 souls. He counted them carefully during the first full day of observation. 6 warriors, men of fighting age who carried weapons and maintained watch rotations. 4 older men, past their prime but still contributing through wisdom and craft. 7 women of various ages, from the one who'd stopped his bullet to the ancient grandmother who seemed to be the center of everything. And 5 children ranging from barely walking to nearly grown. 22 people. Not a war party, not raiders, not the threat that the contracts and bounties and territorial reports had. Described just people, surviving, persisting, holding onto something in a world that was actively trying to erase them. The realization sat in his gut like bad meat. He watched them prepare food, not stolen cattle, but rabbits and desert plants, mesquite beans ground into flour, the kind of subsistence diet that spoke of desperation rather than plenty. He watched them repair clothing, using every scrap of material until it literally fell apart. He watched them maintain weapons not for raiding but for protection, for hunting, for the basic necessities of staying alive in a hostile land. The 43 raids that had justified his contract, began to look different through this lens, began to look less like aggression and more like desperation, less like choice and more like necessity. The line between survival and crime, between taking what you needed and taking what wasn't yours, depended entirely on who was telling the story, and Silas was beginning to realize that he'd only ever heard one version. On the second day, he witnessed something that cracked his resolve even further. A hunting party returned, 3 of the younger warriors, looking exhausted and empty-handed. They'd been gone since before dawn, 8, maybe 10 hours of hard travel through brutal terrain, and they'd found nothing. The disappointment was visible even from Silas's distant vantage point. The women didn't criticize, didn't complain. They simply redistributed what little food remained, ensuring the children ate first, the hunters second, everyone else making do with less. It was a routine they'd clearly practiced before, too many times before. That night he heard singing, not loud, not celebratory, just singing. The kind of songs that held memory, that carried the weight of generations, that reminded people who they were when everything else was being stripped away. The sound drifted up to his position in the rocks, carried on the desert wind, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, Silas felt his throat tighten. When was the last time he'd sung? When was the last time he'd belonged to something larger than himself? When was the last time he'd been part of a community instead of being the wolf that circled it? The woman, he still didn't know her name, had no way of learning it from this distance, appeared throughout each day like a recurring melody. She worked constantly, drew water, helped prepare food, mended clothing, tended to children who might or might not have been her own, spoke with the elders, laughed at something one of the men said, sat alone sometimes, staring out at the desert with an expression that looked like longing. Did she remember that moment? That impossible moment when she'd looked up and their eyes had, met? Connected. Or had it been nothing to her? Just a random glance in a random direction, meaningless except for the significance he'd assigned to it. On the third day, everything changed. A rider appeared from the south. Not Apache, white man, young, probably a scout or messenger. He approached the camp carefully, hands visible, moving slowly. The warriors met him at the perimeter with weapons ready but not raised. A conversation happened that Silas couldn't hear. Then the rider handed something over, a paper, an official document of some kind, and left quickly. The camp erupted into activity. Not panic exactly, but urgent movement. Weapons being checked, supplies being gathered. The kind of preparation that meant movement, relocation, flight. Something in that message had conveyed threat, danger, time running out. Silas watched as they broke down the camp with practiced efficiency. These were people who'd done this before, many times before. They knew how to disappear, how to leave minimal trace, how to transform from a settled community to a mobile band in less than an hour. The skill was impressive and heartbreaking because he knew what that paper probably said. He'd seen enough territorial orders to recognize the pattern. Probably a deadline, a warning, and ultimatum to relocate to a reservation or face forced removal. Or worse, notification that their presence had been deemed hostile. That action had been authorized. That men like him, hunters, trackers, hired guns, were already on the way. Men like him, men exactly like him. The woman, his mind had started calling her Rosa, though he had no idea if that was anywhere close to her real name, worked alongside the others, but several times she paused, looked around. Her gaze swept the rocks, the ridges, the high places where a person could watch unseen. Looking for him, or just for the threat she knew was coming? They were preparing to run. And Silas was beginning to understand that he had a choice to make, a real choice. The kind that defined what kind of man he was versus what kind of man he'd become over 17 years of hunting. He could complete the contract. They'd be moving soon, probably at night, and moving targets were harder but not impossible. Not for someone with his skills. He could wait until they were strung out on the trail, vulnerable, and pick them off systematically. Efficient, professional, the job he'd been paid to do. Or he could let them go. Let them vanish into the desert like smoke, like ghosts, like the memory of something that might have been important once. Let them have whatever chance they could make for themselves in a world that had already decided they had no place in it. The choice should have been clear. He had contracts, obligations, a reputation that mattered in his line of work. If word got out that Silas Crowe had gone soft, had let targets walk away, had allowed sentiment to compromise a job, his life as a hunter would be over. No one would hire him, no one would trust him. He'd be just another washed-up gun, trading on old stories and fading respect. But then again, what was he trading it for? More gold that he never spent? More nights alone in the wilderness? More years of being the thing that people feared, the name that made children quiet and grown men nervous? More time as the wolf instead of the man? The sun climbed toward noon. The camp below was nearly packed. They'd move soon, tonight probably, using darkness as cover. This was his last clear chance, his last opportunity to do what he'd been paid to do. His last moment as the Silas Crowe that everyone knew, relentless, efficient, certain. He raised the rifle one more time, found his position, steadied his breathing, placed his finger on the trigger. With 17 years of practiced expertise, the shot was there, clean, available, inevitable, and then Rosa stepped into the open again. This time she didn't just look up. She stared, directly at his position. No question about it now. She knew he was there, knew what he was, knew what he'd been sent to do. Her face carried no fear, no pleading, just acknowledgement and something that looked almost like understanding. She raised one hand, not in surrender, not in greeting, just raised it. A gesture that meant nothing and everything. A recognition that they were both caught in something larger than themselves. Both playing roles that someone else had written. Both trapped by expectations that had been built over years and generations and centuries of conflict. Silas lowered the rifle, set it down, and made a choice that would change everything. The choice was simple. Warning them meant becoming their enemy's enemy. Silas broke camp as the sun touched the western horizon, packed his gear with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, secured his horse, a sturdy roan, that had carried him through more hunts than he cared to count, and began the careful descent from his watching position. Not away from the Apache camp, toward it. Every instinct screamed against this. 17 years of training, of survival, of caution, said that approaching an Apache camp alone was suicide, that even if his intentions were good, they had no way of knowing that he'd be shot before he got within 100 yards, that this was the stupidest decision he'd ever made. He went anyway. The approach took over an hour, not because of distance, but because he moved carefully, visibly, with his rifle slung across his back and his hands clearly empty. Moved like someone who understood that nervous people with weapons made bad decisions. Moved like someone who was offering himself to whatever judgment waited below. They saw him coming from half a mile away. Of course they did. These people had survived this long because they missed nothing. The camp's movement, which had been steady and purposeful, stopped entirely. Warriors took position. Women and children moved to the center. Weapons were raised, and Silas just kept walking. When he was 200 yards out, the exact distance from which he'd nearly killed them, a warrior stepped forward. Young, fierce, carrying a rifle that was probably older than he was, but still deadly enough. The message was clear. Come closer and die. Silas stopped. Slowly, so slowly, he unslung his rifle, held it up, then set it on the ground, did the same with his revolver. His knife, the small pistol he kept in his boot, disarmed himself completely. Then he stood, hands out, and waited. Minutes passed. The sun continued its descent. The shadows grew longer. The warrior didn't lower his weapon, didn't move, just watched with the kind of patience that came from understanding that time was a weapon too. That making someone wait, making them uncertain, was its own kind of power. Then Rosa appeared. She walked past the warrior, past the defensive line, walked out towards Silas with the kind of calm that suggested she'd already made her own decision about what was happening here. The others called to her, urgent words in Apache that Silas didn't understand but could interpret easily enough. "Stay back, it's dangerous. He's one of them." She ignored them all. When she was 20 feet away, she stopped, studied him with those eyes that had stopped a bullet 3 days ago. And then she spoke, in English, heavily accented but clear enough. "You are the hunter. Not a question, a statement." Silas nodded slowly, felt the weight of that simple acknowledgement settle over him like a physical burden. Yes, he was the hunter, the man sent to kill them, the shadow that had been watching from the rocks, the threat that had been real and immediate and chosen. She tilted her head slightly. The expression on her face wasn't fear. It was something closer to curiosity, or perhaps resignation. "Why do you not shoot?" The question hung in the air between them. Why didn't he shoot? He had a dozen answers. Because something in your eyes stopped me. Because I'm tired. Because I looked too long and saw too much. Because 17 years of hunting had finally caught up with the 12-year-old boy who'd picked up his father's rifle. Because he settled on the truth. "I don't know." She smiled then, small, sad, the kind of smile that carried understanding of how complicated simple things could be, how the space between right and wrong wasn't a line, but a vast, murky territory where people did their best and still failed. "There are others coming," Silas said it flatly. No preamble, no explanation, just the warning that needed to be said. Rosa's smile faded. She'd known, of course. The message that had arrived earlier had probably told her exactly that. But hearing it confirmed, hearing it from the mouth of someone who knew how these hunts worked, that made it real in a different way. "How many? I don't know, but they'll come better prepared than me. More men, more guns, they'll close off the escape routes, they'll finish this." The words felt like betrayal. Betrayal of his contracts, betrayal of the people who'd paid him. Betrayal of everything he'd built over 17 years, but also they felt like the first true thing he'd said in longer than he could remember. Rosa turned, called back to the camp in Apache. A heated discussion followed. Silas couldn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning well enough. Some wanted to kill him immediately, some wanted to run, some wanted to know more. The argument rose and fell like wind through canyon walls. Finally, an older woman emerged, the grandmother he'd noticed before, the one who seemed to be the center around which everything else revolved. She walked with a cane, but her back was straight and her eyes were sharp. She studied Silas with the kind of attention that suggested she was looking at more than just his physical presence. She spoke to Rosa in Apache. Rosa translated. She says, "You carry death with you like a shadow. She sees it, we all see it. Why should we trust you?" Fair question. Maybe the fairest question anyone had ever asked him. Why should they trust the man who'd been sent to kill them? The man who'd been watching them from the rocks, with a rifle and a contract and intent? What possible reason could they have to believe that his change of heart was genuine? Silas thought about that childhood oath, about the farm in Missouri, about 17 years of hunting, about the moment when Rosa had looked up and something inside him had cracked, about the choice between being who he'd been and who he might become. "Because I'm tired of being the shadow." The old woman listened to Rosa's translation, nodded slowly, spoke again. Rosa translated, she says. "Being tired is not the same as being changed, but it is a beginning. You may camp at the edge. If you betray us, you will die first and slowest. This is the promise, fair terms." They brought his weapons to him, unloaded but returned nonetheless, a gesture that carried its own meaning. Trust but verify. Hope but prepare. The Apache way of moving through a world that had proven, again, And again, that hope was dangerous and trust was a luxury. That night, Silas made camp at the perimeter of their circle, close enough to be included, far enough to be watched. He could feel eyes on him constantly, warriors taking turns, making sure he didn't move, didn't threaten, didn't betray this fragile truce. He didn't blame them. He wouldn't have trusted himself either. Sleep came in fragments. Every time he dozed, he jerked awake, certain he'd hear the thunder of approaching horses, the war cries of territorial militia, the sound of everything ending the way these things always ended. But the night remained quiet, just the desert sounds, just the wind, just the breathing of 22 people who decided to give him a chance he probably didn't deserve. Morning came with Rosa bringing him coffee. Real coffee, expensive and hoarded. The kind of luxury that people saved for important occasions. She sat across from him without speaking, just shared the silence and the bitter drink and the sunrise that painted the desert in impossible colors. Finally she spoke. "The others come in 3 days. Maybe 4. We must be gone before then." Silas nodded. 3 days, maybe 4. Not much time to move 22 people, including children and elders, across terrain rough enough to discourage pursuit. Not much time to erase their trail well enough that professional hunters wouldn't find them. Not much time to do what he'd spent 17 years proving was impossible. He looked at Rosa, at the hope and fear and desperate determination in her face, at the woman who'd stopped a bullet without knowing it, who'd extended trust to someone, who deserved none, who was betting everything on the possibility that people could change. And Silas Crowe, hunter, tracker, the shadow that had terrified the territories for 17 years, said something he'd never said before in his professional life. "I know a place, hidden, defensible. It'll be hard getting there, but if we move fast and cover our tracks properly, I can get you there, I can keep you safe." The choice was made. The hunter had become the protector, and everything that came next would determine whether that change meant anything at all. Moving 22 people through hostile territory was nothing like hunting alone. It was chaos trying to pretend it was order. They left that night. Not at dusk, too predictable. Not at midnight, too dark to move children safely. But in that strange hour when the moon was setting and dawn was still hours away, when the world existed in a grey space between darkness and light, the most difficult hour, the least expected, Silas took point. It felt wrong, leading instead of stalking, protecting instead of pursuing. But his skills translated, if awkwardly. Reading terrain, finding paths that hid movement, understanding sightlines and cover. All the things he'd used to hunt could be used to hide if you flipped the equation. The destination was 3 days northeast, a canyon system he'd discovered years ago while tracking a different band. Box Canyon at first glance, appearing to be a trap, but there was a hidden path through collapsed rocks at the far end, leading to a high valley with water and game. Defensible, hidden, the kind of place you could disappear into if you knew it existed. The kind of place most hunters would never find, because they'd never look that carefully. The first night was torment. Children cried, not loud but present. The elderly struggled over rough terrain. The group moved too slowly, left too much trail, made too much noise. Everything Silas had learned about moving silently, about leaving no trace, about becoming a ghost in the wilderness. All of it useless when trying to coordinate this many people. But the Apache knew things he didn't. Knew how to quiet a child without harshness. Knew how to help elders over difficult passages without slowing the whole group. Knew how to move as a unit instead of as individuals. They'd been running for generations. This wasn't new to them. Only the guide was new. Rosa stayed near the middle of the column, helping where needed, but Silas caught her watching him frequently, assessing, judging whether her trust had been earned or betrayed. Fair enough. He was still judging himself on that same measure. By the time the sun rose, they'd covered maybe 8 miles. Not enough. Not nearly enough. A good hunter could cover that distance in 2 hours. But they'd also spent those hours erasing their trail, backtracking, to brush out footprints, using rock whenever possible, splitting up and reconverging to create false trails. They rested during the day's heat in a ravine that offered shade and concealment. No fires, cold food. Children sleeping in exhausted heaps while adults kept watch. Silas studied the back trail through the shimmering air, looking for dust, for movement, for any sign that the other hunters had found them sooner than expected. Nothing yet. But they were out there. He knew it, the way he knew rain from the smell of air, the way he knew winter from the behavior of animals. The hunters were coming. Professional hunters. Men like he'd been. Men who wouldn't hesitate. Men who wouldn't see Rosa's eyes and stop. The thought made his chest tight. That afternoon, one of the warriors approached him. Young man, maybe 25, carrying scars that told stories of previous encounters with white men. His name was something Silas couldn't pronounce, so Rosa told him it meant Swift Arrow. The young man's English was broken but intense. You kill Apache before. Many Apache, not a question. An accusation. Silas met his gaze and didn't flinch from it. Didn't offer excuses or justifications. Just nodded, yes. He'd killed Apache before. Killed raiders and warriors and people who might have been just like Swift Arrow, young, fierce, trying to protect their own. Why we trust you now? Another fair question. The fairest question. Silas looked past Swift Arrow to where Rosa was helping the old grandmother drink water, to where children played quietly in the shade, to where people who should have been dead were alive, because he'd made a choice, because I'm trying to be different, trying to make something right that's been wrong for a long time. Maybe too long. Maybe it's impossible. But I'm trying. Swift Arrow studied him for a long moment, then spat on the ground, not quite at Silas's feet, but close enough to make the point, turned and walked away. The message was clear. You're being tolerated, not trusted. Earn it or die trying. Fair enough. They moved again at dusk. Another night of slow progress over impossible terrain. Another 8 or 9 miles gained. Another series of trail erasures and false paths and desperate hope that it would be enough. The moon was nearly full, which helped with movement, but also made them more visible to anyone watching from high ground. Silas found himself constantly calculating. If he were hunting this group, where would he position himself? What signs would he look for? What mistakes would give them away? Then he'd adjust their route, change their pattern, do everything he could to think like the hunter he'd been, while protecting the people he was trying to become worthy of. On the second day, they reached a water source, a small spring hidden in rocks, essential for survival, but also dangerous, because water sources were exactly where hunters would watch. Silas scouted ahead alone, moving with the old familiar silence, checking sightlines and approaches. Clear, for now. They watered quickly, filled every container, let the horses drink their fill. Moved on before spending more than an hour at the site. Speed mattered more than rest now. Distance mattered more than comfort. That night, Rosa walked beside Silas for a while as they moved. She didn't speak at first, just matched his pace. Finally, the place you take us. Why you know this place? Why you never tell others? Silas thought about that. About all the hiding places he'd discovered over the years. All the secret water sources and hidden valleys and refuges that he'd catalogued in his mind. Places he could have reported. Places that would have made hunting easier for others. Places he'd kept to himself for reasons he'd never quite examined. Maybe I always knew I might need somewhere to hide someday. Maybe I always knew that hunting couldn't last forever. That eventually I'd be on the other side. She considered that, nodded slowly, then asked the question he'd been dreading. The men who come. You know them? Some of them. Probably. They are like you were? Yes, exactly like I was. Relentless, efficient. They won't stop because they see someone's eyes or have a moment of doubt. They'll finish the job because that's what they're paid to do. Because that's what their reputation requires. Because that's who they are. Like you were. Like I was. They walked in silence for a while. Then Rosa said something that hit harder than any bullet. When they find us, you will have to choose again. Choose between the man you were and the man you want to be. Choose with bullets and blood instead of just words. She was right. The realization settled over him like cold water. Talking about change was easy. Warning them was easy. Even guiding them was relatively easy. But when the hunters arrived, and they would arrive, he'd have to point his rifle at men who were doing exactly what he'd done for 17 years. Men who were just following contracts. Men who were just surviving the only way they knew how. Men who were him. The third day dawned with storm clouds building to the west. Good and bad, rain would erase their trail completely, but it would also make travel miserable and slow them down. Silas studied the sky with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read weather like some men read books. 6 hours, maybe 8, then it would hit. The canyon was still half a day away at their current pace. They'd have to push harder, move faster, risk exposure for the sake of reaching shelter before the storm broke. Risk everything on the chance that they could cover the last distance before the hunters cut them off. Silas called for increased pace. The warriors understood immediately. The women gathered the children. The elderly were helped onto horses. The entire group shifted into a rhythm that spoke of desperation, of knowing that time had run out, and now it was just speed against pursuit. They moved through the morning at a pace that was almost reckless, over ridges that offered no cover, across open stretches where anyone watching from high ground would see them, through terrain that screamed their passage to anyone who knew how to read it. But the storm was coming, and sometimes you had to bet everything on nature being a better ally than caution. By early afternoon they reached the outer approaches to the canyon. The landscape here was broken stone and difficult passages, hell on horses, punishment on people, but defensible, very defensible. If they could reach the box canyon before the hunters arrived, if they could get through the hidden pass into the high valley, then Silas saw the dust. Behind them, southeast, maybe 3 miles back. Moving fast, his stomach dropped. Too soon, they'd come too soon. He'd miscalculated, or they'd been better than he'd expected, or luck had simply run out. The hunters had found them with the destination in sight but not reached. Rosa saw his expression, understood immediately. She called to the others in Apache. The group shifted again, no longer moving toward the canyon, but moving toward positions. The warriors spread out. The women and children moved to the center. The old patterns, the old preparations, the things you did when running had failed and fighting was all that remained. Silas counted the dust trails. 4, maybe 5. Not a large force, but large enough. Professional hunters didn't need numbers. They needed skill and determination and the willingness to do what needed to be done. Exactly what he'd had for 17 years. Swift. Arrow appeared at his shoulder, handed him his rifle loaded, ready. Their eyes met. No words needed. The message was clear. You said you were different. Time to prove it. Silas took the rifle, felt its familiar weight, felt 17 years of muscle memory activate, felt the old certainty trying to resurface, the certainty that he was good at this, that violence was something he understood, that killing was just another skill he'd mastered. But his hands were shaking, just slightly, just enough to notice, not from fear, from something else entirely, from the knowledge that Rosa had been right, that choosing with bullets and blood was different than choosing with words, that becoming a different man meant being willing to destroy what he'd been. The dust clouds grew closer, maybe 2 miles now, coming fast. Silas looked at Rosa, at the children behind her, at the old grandmother who'd given him a chance he didn't deserve, at Swift Arrow, who tolerated him but didn't trust him, at 22 people who'd bet their lives on the possibility that one man could change. He raised his rifle, found a position in the rocks, steadied his breathing the way he'd done 1,000 times before, and waited for the hunters to come within range. But this time he was waiting to protect instead of to kill. This time he was the shield instead of the sword. This time everything he'd learned about dealing death would be used to defend life. If that wasn't redemption, it was at least a start. The storm clouds built overhead. Thunder rolled across the desert. And the hunters came on, relentless and certain, expecting an easy conclusion to a simple contract. They had no idea that the most dangerous hunter in the territories was waiting for them. No idea that Silas Crowe had switched sides. No idea that everything they expected was about to shatter like glass under a hammer. The rain began to fall, and with it, everything changed. The first raindrop hit Silas's face like a benediction or a condemnation. Hard to tell which. Maybe both. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke with the kind of violence that only desert storms could achieve, going from nothing to everything in the space of heartbeats. Sky opening, water pouring, the world reduced to grey curtains and the sound of rain hammering stone. The hunters stopped advancing. Silas could see them through his rifle scope, barely visible through the deluge. 5 men, spread out, professional formation. They'd taken cover in rocks about a mile out, waiting for the worst of the storm to pass before continuing their approach. Smart. That's what he would have done. That's exactly what he would have done. The rain bought time. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. But it also created mud, made footing treacherous, turned the hidden pass into the high valley, into a death trap for horses and people trying to move quickly. The protection they'd been racing toward was suddenly twice as dangerous to reach. Rosa appeared beside him, soaked through, water streaming down her face. She had to shout to be heard over the rain. "We cannot reach the valley in this. The children will fall. The horses will break legs. We are trapped." Silas knew she was right. The storm that should have saved them had instead created a new problem. They couldn't advance. They couldn't retreat. They could only wait here in the outer canyon approaches and hope that 5 professional hunters somehow missed 22 people with nowhere to go. Not likely. Not likely at all. He studied the terrain with new eyes. Not hunter's eyes anymore. Defender's eyes. The canyon approaches were a maze of broken stone, narrow passages, high walls, difficult ground for attackers. Good sight lines for defenders. If they had to make a stand here, it could be worse, could be. But 5 professional hunters against 6 Apache warriors and 1 reformed manhunter. Those weren't good odds. Not when the hunters had better weapons, better supplies, and no hesitation about what needed to be done. Swift Arrow joined them, spoke in Apache to Rosa, pointing at positions, indicating fields of fire, making the kinds of calculations that warriors had been making for centuries. Rosa translated, "He says the rain helps us. They cannot see clearly, cannot shoot accurately. If we position well, we can hold them until darkness. Then we slip away." Silas shook his head. These men wouldn't give up that easily. He knew them, maybe not by name, but by type. They'd press the attack even in poor conditions. They'd accept casualties if necessary. They'd do whatever it took to complete the contract, because that's what their reputation required. Because that's what his reputation had required. The rain continued its assault. Thunder cracked close enough to feel in the chest. Lightning illuminated the canyon in sharp, brief moments, freeze frames of a world carved from stone and water. And in one of those lightning flashes, Silas saw the hunters moving, not waiting, not sheltering, moving forward through the storm, using the noise and chaos as cover, closing the distance while visibility was measured in yards instead of miles, professional, aggressive, relentless. He'd trained some of these tactics, had used them himself, and now those same tactics were being used to kill people he'd promised to protect. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. Contact came when the hunters were 200 yards out, rifle shots cutting through the rain. Impacts on stone, sending sharp cracks echoing through the canyon. Not aimed shots, suppressing fire. The kind of shooting meant to pin defenders in place while the attackers maneuvered. Swift Arrow and the other warriors returned fire, disciplined, controlled, making each shot count because ammunition was precious. The battle developed the way most battles did. Pockets of intense violence separated by tense waiting, chaos punctuated by silence, everything moving too fast and too slow, simultaneously. Silas found himself in a strange position. He could identify the hunters' tactics before they executed them, could predict their movements, could understand their thinking because he'd thought the same thoughts 1,000 times. He called out warnings to Swift Arrow in English, which Rosa translated rapidly into Apache, their flanking left. 2 men watched the high ground, suppressing fire coming. Stay low. Reload now while they're repositioning. 30 seconds. Each warning proved accurate. Each prediction played out. The Apache warriors looked at him with something between suspicion and gratitude. He was either the best ally they'd ever had, or he was directing his former colleagues to victory. Just under fire was its own kind of torment. The fight settled into a stalemate. The hunters couldn't advance without exposing themselves to defensive fire. The defenders couldn't retreat without exposing the women and children. Both sides dug in. Both sides waited for the advantage that would break the deadlock. Then Silas saw it, one of the hunters breaking cover, sprinting for a position that would give him clear line of sight into where the women and children sheltered. Young man, fast, determined, making the kind of bold move that either won battles or got you killed. Silas recognized the tactic because he'd invented it. Aggressive flanking under covering fire. High risk but high reward. If that hunter reached that position, the fight was over. He'd have clean shots at non-combatants. The Apache would have to surrender or watch their families die. Silas's rifle came up automatically. 17 years of muscle memory. The scope found the running figure. The crosshairs settled. His finger moved to the trigger. The shot was there, clear, certain, achievable, but his hands were shaking again. Worse now, because this wasn't some abstract choice anymore. This was a specific man, young, probably with family of his own, probably doing this job for the same reason Silas had done it for 17 years, about to die because Silas had switched sides. Rosa's voice cut through his paralysis. If you do not shoot. We all die. The children die. The choice is made. She was right. The choice was made. He'd made it 3 days ago when he'd walked down from the rocks with his weapons unloaded and his hands empty. He'd made it when he'd promised to get them to safety. He'd made it every moment since, when he'd chosen to be something other than what he'd been, but knowing the choice was made didn't make the consequences easier. Silas pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked. The shot echoed through the canyon, mixing with thunder. 200 yards away, the running hunter dropped mid-stride, rolled and lay still. For a moment, everything stopped. The rain continued. Thunder rolled, but the shooting ceased. Both sides processing what had just happened. Processing that one of the hunters had just been shot by. By who? By what? Then chaos erupted. The remaining hunters opened up with everything they had. Not disciplined fire anymore. Angry fire. Vengeful fire. One of their own had fallen, and they wanted blood for it. Bullets filled the air, ricocheting off stone, sending up sprays of rock dust and rain. Silas worked the bolt on his rifle. Found the next target. A shape in the rocks. Another shot. Another hit. A scream that might have been rage or pain or both. He was efficient, professional, doing what he'd always done, except the targets were reversed. Except he felt sick to his stomach while doing it. Swift Arrow appeared beside him, rifle blazing, providing covering fire. They worked together without speaking, one shooting while the other reloaded, coordinating fields of fire, protecting each other the way warriors did. The young Apache, who'd spat at his feet 2 days ago, was now fighting alongside him, trusting him with his life. The moment felt significant in ways Silas couldn't quite process while bullets were flying. The fight lasted maybe 20 minutes total, maybe less. Time behaved strangely under fire, expanding and contracting, each second containing hours, while entire minutes vanished, unnoticed. When it ended, 3 of the 5 hunters were down. 1 dead certainly, 2 wounded, maybe dying. The other 2 had retreated, dragging their casualties, disappearing into the rain and the maze of canyon approaches. Victory, if you could call it that. If survival counted as victory, Silas lowered his rifle. His hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped somewhere during the fight, replaced by the cold certainty of necessity. He'd killed men he might have known, men who were doing exactly what he'd done, men who'd had families and histories and reasons for their choices. The weight of that settled over him like stone. Rosa appeared through the rain, looked at him with those eyes that had stopped a bullet, spoke quietly. "You have paid the price now, the price of choosing. You cannot go back to what you were. Those men, they were your tribe once. Now they are dead because of you." She wasn't cruel, just honest, stating the reality that Silas was already feeling in every cell of his body. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had burned bridges that couldn't be rebuilt, had made enemies of people who'd once been colleagues, but he'd also saved 22 lives, including hers. The rain began to ease. The storm moved east, leaving behind soaked earth and gray skies, and the kind of silence that follows violence. The Apache moved quickly, checking the fallen hunters, gathering weapons and supplies, erasing what traces they could. Practical. Survival didn't pause for moral complications. Silas helped where he could. Felt strange touching the bodies of men who died by his hand. Strange and necessary. They deserved burial, but there was no time. The two who'd escaped would bring others. The contract wouldn't be abandoned. More hunters would come. They always did. By the time darkness fell, they'd reached the hidden valley. The pass had been treacherous, exactly as feared, but they'd managed it carefully. No broken legs, no lost people, just exhaustion and relief and the tentative hope that maybe, finally, they'd found a place where they could rest. The valley was everything Silas had, or promised: water, grass, game, defensible, hidden, the kind of place that could sustain 22 people indefinitely if they were careful. If they were patient. That night they made fires. Real fires. The first in days. Children laughed, quiet but present. Food was cooked. Songs were sung softly. The tension that had carried them through 3 days of desperate flight began to ease. Silas sat apart, as always, but less far apart than before. The space between him and the others had shrunk somehow. Not gone, might never be gone, but smaller. Rosa brought him food, sat beside him without asking permission. They ate in silence for a while, watching the fires, watching the children, watching life assert itself after coming so close to ending. Finally she spoke. "Swift Arrow says you are no longer a white man. You are something between something new. He does not know if this is good or bad, but it is what you are." Silas considered that. Something between something new, not the hunter he'd been. Not quite Apache, just someone who'd made a choice and was living with the consequences. He could accept that, the old grandmother called to Rosa. She rose, started to walk away, then paused, looked back at him with an expression that carried weight. "We leave in the morning. There is a place far to the north, colder, harder, but safer. You can come with us. Or you can return to your old life. The choice is always yours." She left before he could respond. Left him sitting there with the question hanging in the air like smoke. Return to his old life, if that was even possible anymore. Or continue forward into something unknown, something uncomfortable, something that might never fully accept him, but at least acknowledged his existence. Silas looked at his hands, scarred, weathered, hands that had killed for 17 years. Hands that had killed again today, but for different reasons. Same tools, different purpose. Did that change what they were? Did intention matter more than action? He didn't know. Might never know. But as he sat there, watching the fires and the people who'd trusted him enough to stay alive, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in 17 years. Something that had been buried beneath contracts and gold and justified violence. Something that might have been peace, or might have been the beginning of understanding what peace could mean. The stars emerged as the clouds cleared. Sharp and cold and infinite. The same stars that had watched him hunt for 17 years. The same stars that were watching him now, transformed into something he couldn't quite name. Protector, guardian, reformed hunter. Somewhere between what he'd been and what he might become. In the morning he would ride north with them. Would help them find that safer place. Would use everything he'd learned about hunting to help them hide. Would spend whatever time remained to him trying to balance the scales that had been so heavily weighted toward death. It wouldn't be enough. Could never be enough. 17 years of hunting couldn't be erased by protecting one band, no matter how completely he committed to it. The men he'd killed, both those he'd hunted and those he'd fought today, would always be there in his memory, in his dreams, in the space behind his eyes. But maybe trying to balance the scales was enough. Maybe the attempt itself was the point. Maybe becoming someone different wasn't about erasing who you'd been, but about choosing, every single day, to be something other than that. Rosa returned one more time that night, sat beside him, didn't speak, just sat there sharing the silence and the starlight and the possibility of a future that was different than the past. And in that moment, that simple, profound moment, Silas Crowe understood something he'd missed for 17 years. That being seen, truly seen by another person, was worth more than all the gold he'd ever earned. That connection, real, genuine, undeserved connection, was what made life worth protecting. That the opposite of hunting wasn't hiding. It was belonging. He'd hunted her tribe, had come to destroy them. Had been the shadow, the threat, the inevitable ending, but her eyes had ensnared him, had stopped him cold, had asked a question that took 3 days and a gunfight to answer. Who do you want to be? And Silas Crowe, no longer quite a hunter, not yet quite a protector, just a man trying to be better than he'd been, finally had an answer. Someone different. Someone worthy, someone who'd spent 17 years dealing death and might spend whatever remained trying to defend life. It wasn't redemption. Redemption was probably impossible, but it was a path forward. And sometimes a path was enough, and the fire burned low. The stars wheeled overhead. The people he'd sworn to protect slept peacefully, trusting him to keep watch. And Silas Crowe, transformed by a glance, redeemed by a choice, still carrying the weight of 17 years, but no longer crushed by it, stood guard through the night, because that's what protectors did. That's what he was now, for better or worse. And if his hands still remembered how to kill, well, at least now they were remembering in service of life. The desert wind carried the smell of rain and possibility. Dawn would come soon, and with it another day of choosing who to be. Another day of proving that change, however difficult, however costly, was possible. Another day of being something other than the shadow. And for the first time in 17 years, that was enough. Thanks for riding with us. If you enjoyed this tale from the frontier, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss the next story under the desert sun. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And before you ride off, check out these other tales of grit, honor, and redemption. Click one of these videos on your screen, partner.